everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning, and we have a fun topic to discuss, the transition from the web client to the unified interface. We are in a situation at the moment where the web client that we all used to work with and loved is being deprecated, most likely in the October timeframe, and likely to be discontinued 1 year later. So that means that in terms of our deployed solutions that we have out there with our end users. Phil, I'm pausing. Was there a comment?
I think it's people joining, Paul. I'll try and mute as we go.
Okay. No, that's fine. Thank you. So I think the challenge for our projects and our deployed solution at the moment is to communicate with our user base as quickly as possible. When something changes, we always have the fear of the unknown. I think if we guide the transitioning process, there's some exciting stuff happening and a lot of things that we can take advantage of. This playbook, the PowerPoint deck that supports my presentation today, will be available as a download later. And its purpose is really to help our customers, our partners, as well as the various field roles we have inside Microsoft to help the transition from the web client to the unified interface. So we hope this guide will help you understand what the unified interface is at a high level, understand how you approach the transitioning process, what is the strategy for having the discussions about the transition, how do we ensure a smooth transition, how do we manage our user inquiries and potential objections that we may get on this journey, and where can you find additional resources that will support the process. We have summarized 7 factors that we see as key success factors for doing it. And these are really directed at you and your community, right? In other words, to your users, you need to make sure that the unified interface is understood, that your users see the value of the unified interface. You need to, of course, assess the scope of transitioning to the unified interface because there's project work activity coming. You need to manage that transition process. If you're not taking advantage of key benefits of the unified interface, we are leaving some value on the table. There are some changes and gaps in the unified interface that you may want to deal with and see how you can position that to your user community. And you will get some inquiries and objections, and you would need some resources to be able to handle that. So the playbook today is really divided in 4 chapters for us. First chapter we refer to as Initiate. It's all about having the right conversations with your user community. Chapter 2 is Exploring the Unified Interface. So this is all about how do I start? You know, I'm new to this game. What should my first step be? Chapter 3 is about the transitioning process itself. So once we have a project on the go, how would we put that together? How would we plan and execute that? Chapter 4 is really about optimizing the value, and don't think of these as sequential steps. You know, optimize overlaps with the other phases. Optimize about considering where you are, what new opportunities are there, and how we can maximize the value for your organization on that. And lastly, we're building out a slide on available resources so that if you need more detail, you can dig into that. The playbook is meant to be the table of content and the introduction to this entire space. So let's look at each chapter. What is the content within that? This in classic presentation style. I guess I'm now telling you what I'm going to tell you, and then I will tell you, you know, so we will go into each chapter in more detail. So I'm not going to explain everything now. But the initiate phase is really about having the right conversations. Figuring out what is the unified interface, what is CDS, you know, what's the terminology, why is the unified interface even there? And we can put some initial answers there. You know, we know it's a modern interface, it's a responsive interface, it's fast, it's flexible. And we also know the web client will be deprecated. So this is all part of that initial conversation. We provide you with some reasons of why we are deprecating and discontinuing the web client. We will also introduce you to what is new and different in the unified interface. You can take advantage of that, and there'll be some resources linked to each chapter. The second chapter will be about exploring the unified interface. And our basic guidance is to create a test application as quickly as possible, then create a pilot app that you may deploy to a small group of users, collecting some feedback and learning, and then migrating your bigger community to the unified interface. When should you do this is an interesting question. You know, if you're migrating from on-premises to online, for example, we would probably do the migration as you migrate to online. If you are online already, you may consider starting now and deploy towards the end of the year, because otherwise you may be pushing a deadline on yourselves when we discontinue the web client eventually. So our recommendation is really to start soon, and we'll talk a bit more about that in chapter 2. Chapter 3 is about the transitioning itself. How do we do this? Normally we start with a business assessment. There are various transition paths that you can follow, and we will look at the 3 different paths that we have in mind, and you could have some hybrid between them. We look at some pre-planning activities that you should do. We look at how you formulate the value proposition. This is very important, because otherwise it's very difficult to get the user adoption, to get the management support, to get the budget support to execute on this. And then we look at how to plan and execute tangibly on the transition. And the last chapter we will be looking at is the optimization. How do you maximize the opportunity? What is the work cycle? How do I monitor my adoption? How do I learn? How do I derive and communicate the revised value proposition? How do I plan my future stages? What is the new rhythm of my business going to look like? That is impacted by the product roadmap, so we need to consider a few product considerations. There's the cadence of regular refresh, regular releases coming through. How do you work that into the rhythm of your business? Then we have some related considerations. They are always in a big product like Dynamics 365 for customer engagement, some deprecations, some discontinuations of functionality, and we need to understand those. What gaps and issues does that present us with? How do we deal with those? How do we move forward? And where can you get more information, and where can you escalate to if you get stuck? That really would conclude our story for today. So with that being the outline, let us dive straight into chapter 1, which is all about the initiate phase, or having the right conversations. I want to start with some terminology, because this is a space full of acronyms, full of new terms, full of terms that are different to ones that we've used in the past. And so it's useful to just pause and see what we mean by things. You will hear about the Common Data Service, or CDS. This is essentially a mechanism that lets you securely store and manage data that is used by business applications. Now, this is actually not a new thing. If you're an old player in the Dynamics 365 world, we've spoken about XRM for a long, long time, right? So this is how we used point-and-click tailoring to build new applications. We didn't go to a database to create a new entity. We just went into, if I can say, our XRM capability and say, add a new entity. These are the fields. Let's paint some forms. We have taken that XRM capability and packaged it as CDS. And of course, you can use it with classic customer engagement applications, but you can also use it for many other applications. So that is CDS. Then we talk about model-driven apps. Model-driven apps is really that point-and-click development that we do on top of CDS. So that's your form editor. That is your view editor. So when we say model-driven apps, it's not something new. It is a new word for an approach that we've had for a really, really long time. So what we used to call XRM is now called model-driven apps. We can contrast also model-driven apps with something that's new in the ecosystem called Canvas apps. Canvas apps are pixel-perfect apps. We created with a designer environment. We use Power Apps, and the designing feels like drawing pictures like you would used to do in PowerPoint, and then adding some business logic with Excel-like formulas. And Power Apps can talk to the data in CDS, which means they can make great companion apps for your Dynamics customer engagement environment. They are not limited to that. You can create all sorts of apps with that. We have hundreds of data connectors. So it also brings together rich data sources, and not just data sources, but functionality that is available in the cloud, like artificial intelligence, integrating that into apps. And this is something that can be increasingly used with CDS. So keep that in mind, and we'll come back to Canvas apps later on. And now let's come to the unified interface itself. We actually have 2 user interfaces really in this world. We have the Canvas apps, which are these pixel-perfect apps. And then the unified interface, that is the user interface for all the model-driven experiences. So if you have a model-driven app going forward, its user interface is the unified interface. We call it the unified interface because it spans really the mobile environment, so what we see on phones and on tablets. It encompasses what we have in Outlook. So if you look at the app for Outlook, the Outlook Mail app as we also call it, you will find that that interface is the unified interface. And in fact, on mobile and on Outlook, we only have the unified interface. We have still at the moment the web client. So this is our legacy user interface. It still exists. And so we let it coexist to support our current customer needs. But on the web, you also now see the unified interface. And in the long run, the web client will fade away because the unified interface will be the primary and only client infrastructure that we do, and all our product investment is focused on the unified interface. Why are we investing in this? I don't know if I should say this on the recording, but on the classic web client, I'm kind of referring to it nowadays as our 1950s user interface. It has aged, right? It was great a couple of years ago, but technology has moved on. We needed to modernize the design itself, make it modern, make it sexy again. We needed to focus on handling things like accessibility so that differently abled people can also access our software and be productive with it. And internally, we needed to reduce complexity, costs and time delays that are caused by having investments across multiple code bases, supporting the web client and the unified interface. That gives you two places to fix it. If you have a different code base for Outlook and a different one for mobile, we are using our resources to just fix the same bug in many environments instead of investing that money towards investments that will benefit you, our customer. So that's the quick background in our thinking. Now, when we ask what is new and different in the unified interface, I'm not going to do a deep dive on that. For that, we have a separate tech talk, which I'll refer you to later on. But you'll see that the look and feel is different. So we have a new sitemap, a new navigation bar, a new ribbon commanding experience. So if you look at the old web screen and you contrast that with the unified interface, you'll see, firstly, that the navigation has just moved to the left. For those of you who've been around for a long time, I should say, has moved to the left again. So we have the navigation here. It can be collapsed. It takes up much less space. The design is also what we call a responsive design. So it works on all app surfaces and devices. If you're on a small screen or a very large screen, it will reflow all the fields, the columns, and the sections to work on that. There's great performance coming with this new unified interface. It uses modern browser storage, very efficient metadata synchronization. So one of the things that you will notice that your end users will comment on is it is fast. So it is sexy on the one hand, it's modern, and it's fast. And the third thing, it is fast. So there's your core value proposition to your users for introducing this functionality. Now, how do you introduce it? So if you want to explore this environment, our first recommendation is to just start. You don't have to start exactly in this pattern that we propose, but we think you should just start very quickly. You should do a super quick test. What you can do on a test environment is you just switch on and say, we're going to have unified interface only. And if you do this and you test with a user and you quickly go through the system, the web client would be disabled by switching that flag on. And therefore, you will only see unified interface across the system, and you can very quickly get some feedback and get a sense of what this would look like for a user without making any real investment on your part. Then you could create a test app. What you do with a test app is you take your current sitemap and you can create an app module from the sitemap. An app module is just a grouping of functionality that will allow you to test on the unified interface. And you run that app basically, and you've got your whole application in there. You haven't done any technical work yet, and you can just do a quick check what is working well, what's not working so well. You can identify some issues and gaps and get some learnings from the way the app renders. Then we have a fairly strong recommendation that you should create and launch a pilot app. You identify and target a small user group, and ideally one with a high-value use case. And you create this small app with just the functionality needed to deliver this use case. You can run this now in parallel with the web client, and you deploy this actually to that small group of users, and you get the other feedback. Even better, after 3 weeks, you threaten to switch off that pilot app. Because when you do that, people will likely come back to you and say, no, we don't want you to switch it off. And then you'll see the real personal value that such an app can deliver. This is great for learning. You get to the point where you understand how the unified interface works, what the benefits are that you can get from it, and now you can use that feedback and use that to improve and expand on your transitioning towards the unified interface. So when do we do this? So our view is the sooner you start, the better. There are some web client considerations. The deprecation is imminent. No new investments are being made in the web client. Bug fixes for the web client, we are focusing only on regression. So if you identify a bug that's not been seen before, you're not going to get great support from Microsoft to invest time and energy in fixing that bug. Some of our newer capabilities are only supported on the unified interface. So if you want to take advantage of innovations that we make, then you need to be on the unified interface. The web client is slower than the unified interface, and the experience, as we said, is becoming somewhat aged. So from a timing perspective, if you start the transition soon, you can have a flexible and incremental approach to get there because you're not fighting some deadline. If you leave it too long, you will create project pressure because we will be discontinuing the web client at a particular date. But on the positive side, starting early also brings the benefits of the unified interface early. And that's actually my main reason to start early. I think you can generate a lot of excitement with your users. And if you are excited about the new capabilities, presenting it to them, you also reduce the fear, the uncertainty, make them less apprehensive, and make them enthusiastic towards the change that might be coming. Right, let's talk about the transition itself. Where do we really start? Now, the step that we often skip is really the business assessment. You know, I don't want to start with the technology when I'm really going to change the user interface, because it is an opportunity for me to understand where I am, to understand the current state of my business. So I could ask questions like, does our current deployment align well with the way our processes should work? Because quite often the system may have an aged implementation of processes, and actually our organizational processes have changed. So we don't have a good match anymore. So are there any areas that are no longer relevant in our system that we could drop? Are there things that are inadequate for our users that we need to improve? And do we have a good idea on what the future holds? You know, what are our roadmap plans as a business? Where do we want to take this application? And how does that align with the roadmap that's coming from Microsoft in the product? How would we mix these things together for a good outcome? So once you have the situation, you've analyzed it, you have some problems identified, and you have some opportunities identified, this is a really good input for the plan that you take forward. It also means you need to understand your business users. So if you currently have a gap in understanding, use this time to really observe your users, how they are using the system, identify the patterns and the groups of users so that you can see potential applications that you could cut this. Currently, we tend to have one big application in Dynamics, and we could deliver it in smaller chunks that are easier to consume. We like to say sweat the small stuff, you know, look for the really small changes that you can make that will improve usability and that would really add to the personal value and personal productivity of the users using the system. So take time to really consider what's not working so well, where you can make small tweaks. This often doesn't cost you a lot of money. It really just costs you the time and attention to things that would make the difference. Also useful to capture some measures for the current state, because then you can measure the improvement that you get afterwards as well. We like to talk about a business value planning framework. So you start by engaging the business early and throughout, and then some guidelines into what you focus on. You know, focus on limiting the distractions, you know, having role-based apps so people can do the work that they do and they don't get huge menu navigations, complexity and things that's not relevant to their role. Make sure we know what the business value is of every point that we bring into the system, every change that we introduce. Let's focus on delivering insight to people, not just data. You know, system is not about data maintenance. System is about giving the right insight to a user to guide him in what the best thing is that he should do next to get a desired outcome. Aligned to the supportability of the product. So that basically is fancy text, guys, for saying let's not do unsupported stuff. When the user interface changes, some changes happen at the technical level. We want to align with that and not have unsupported code. We want to align and take advantage of what's coming from the product roadmap. And then all of this requires communication, communication, communication. You need to be in touch with your users on a regular basis to have success. Now, we have three potential paths that we see for migrating to the unified interface. The first one I would call building targeted apps, so an incremental approach, right? So we would identify a community of users with a certain set of use cases. We build something for those users. and we deploy to them, and the other users remain on the web client. Then we hive off a next set of users, look at their use cases, we build them an app, we deploy that, and we slowly reduce the usage of our web client as we move on to the unified interface. This approach has some great benefits. It's easy to get started. You have a low cost, you have quick time to market, and you can take business value very quickly. That's what I really like about this approach. The end user impact is minimized because I don't deal with thousands of users in one go. I have a small community, I train those, I get feedback from them, I do the next small community. So there's no big event, where all users needs to be trained, all the change management needs to happen, etc. You can also, if there's a known gap in the unified interface, you may, when you've looked at your solution in one of those quick tests, you may have found that there's one or two things that will not work so well for you. You may have a lot of dialogues in your system, and dialogues we will talk about later will not be present in the unified interface. So if something like that impacts you, well, you can pick a usage area where you're not using dialogues, and you could actually deploy there, so it does not have to be a blocker for your entire deployment. And it has the beautiful benefit that your teams learn from experience, because there's nothing like actually building an app and deploying it in production to teach you what you need to know and to make you do things better going forward. So those are really the benefits of an incremental approach. The drawbacks, of course, also exist. You have two user interface styles to support and maintain. You may have some of your users for some of the functionality on the unified interface, the others on the older web client. You'll see that the users on the web client do not get the performance and usability that their colleagues on the unified interface get, so you may get increasing pressure to move them along as well. And you may have increased dissatisfaction on the web client side because we no longer do bug fixes and no new features are hitting it, so those users are being left behind a little bit. So in the incremental approach, you need to balance the benefits with the drawbacks when you consider that. A full transition would be to replace the web client entirely. Maybe you decide this has got to be a big bang for you. You want a single user interface to support and maintain. All users will get the performance and usability benefits from the unified interface. So that's great. Everybody gets the latest bug fixes and they get the latest new features. So these are the benefits. But of course, the drawbacks, a big bang approach is riskier. All the issues and gaps that you could encounter needs to be considered, and you need to find a way past them. All end users are impacted, so your training and your change management becomes bigger. And you lose the benefit of teams learning on the go. Teams actually doing something small, tends to learn on the go, and that is a benefit that you lose in a big bang. In real life, I think a hybrid between these two parts are probably what you're going to be looking at, right? You may do one or two targeted apps before you do your full transition. And that's probably the best approach because we maximize the benefits and minimize the drawbacks of both scenarios. And that's probably what we would do in real life. There's one special case, and that's what I call the on-premise to online migration. So if you're coming from version 8.2 or older on-premise, you are using the old web client. If you're going to go to version 9 in the cloud, you're going to do changes anyway. You need to change normally some client scripts due to API deprecations. You may need to make some of your unsupported code supported. You need to change your integrations to work in the cloud. So in any event, you have a bunch of work to do. You have testing to do, etc. So adding the transition to the user interface at the same time is actually recommended. It does add to the workload, of course, but you soften that impact because you're doing the training and the change management only once, you're doing the testing only once. And so normally I advise that we go for the change to the unified interface as we migrate from on-prem to the cloud as well. So those are the classic paths that we would typically consider. Now, you need to understand in your pre-planning what I call the compulsory changes. There are certain changes in the new unified experience that you cannot not take. They are just part of the new unified interface, right? So the social pane gets replaced by a timeline control. It's different. We think it's better as well, but it is a change and you have to take that change, right? There's no choice on that. The business process renders differently. We think it's improved, but you don't get a choice in that. It comes to you. So you need to understand it and evaluate it. You get navigation changes. So we have a simplified sitemap that's easier to navigate. We have new icons, new colors. We use something called Fluent Design when we design the look and feel. There's something called reflow. So when you take the screen and you move it into a smaller user interface like you would have it on a phone, you will see that the same screen just renders differently. So the tabs will now be below one another and you would have some scrolling. So you would basically get the same experience but rendered slightly differently to suit the device. The other considerations that you have for on-demand workflows, if you want to run a workflow from the user interface, you have to enable Microsoft Flow because the workflows are listed on the Flow button on your menu. And you see to the top right here, there's a Flow button and your on-demand workflows will be there. If you disable Flow, you will not see your on-demand workflow, so you need to consider that. Dialogues is a fairly big item. Now, it may be big or small for you. If you have a big investment in dialogues, then you need to relook and see what you do in that space. But dialogues do not exist on the unified interface. We found that it had too many limitations and the user interface was problematic, and particularly problematic for mobile devices. So when we look at real world usage patterns, we see that people do things like approvals, data validation, data entry, some notifications, some scripted actions. And we think you can plan for alternative options. There are some interesting ones. We're talking about Canvas apps, these pixel perfect power apps, the scenarios we spoke about before. We talk about using Microsoft Flow maybe for something like an approval cycle, or using the business process flow structure, using playbooks, which is new functionality that we've introduced, and there could be other alternatives here. But this is one big area where you may need to look at and see how you will take stock of what you have and how you might take that forward. There will be other things in time because there will be new deprecations coming in, etc. So always check the latest blogs from Microsoft and also the release notes associated with that to understand the compulsory changes that are coming in. But then there are optional changes, you know, and this is where you can actually rethink the user experience, right? So first you need to understand how this app model works, right? So app is really just a way of combining a subset of functionality and bringing only the relevant stuff together as a single app. So for an app, I can say have just the account entity, the contact entity, the lead entity, and the opportunity entity. And I really simplify my user's life by just showing those entities. I can go further and say this is for the sales team. Don't show the views that are relevant to the sales manager, just show the views that are relevant to the salespeople themselves. So they have fewer views to navigate to, fewer dashboards to navigate to. We bring just the elements into the app that would be needed, and that is what we deploy to the users. So how do we build these apps? Well, we focus on user personas, their goals and motivations, what they are trying to do with the data. We limit the distraction, focus on how we're bringing insights to them and how we can make them productive. And that gives us a way to build apps. Now, with a unified interface, you need at least one app. You can't dodge that because we only deliver the unified interface via the app concept. So you could just put your entire customer engagement solution into a single app, but that we do not recognize as a good pattern. For us, the best practice would be a small, probably single-digit number of apps that are targeted on specific user personas. I may have a sales app. I may have a field service app. I may have a marketing app, something that just consolidates a certain set of functionality. If I have a very different function in my business that do special things, then I would combine all those special things in a special app. That's how we think about apps. And then you can deploy them and allocate the security separately to the apps, and you simplify the lives that people have. There, of course, also technically in the product, there are some great new capabilities that you can add. There is something called the reference panel. Reference panel, I'm not going to go into detail now, but one of our supporting decks has detail on the reference panel in it, and you can read online about it as well. It's a great way to get more work done without leaving your form, bringing a lot of rich content into one area of your form, really upping the information density and making you more productive. We have a bunch of custom controls now that you can use to make your form look even more sexy and easier to use and have even more positive business impact as you roll it out to the users. On the bottom of the slide, I've given you some of the components that pre-exist that you can just add to a form. But you can also build your own custom controls. This little percentage indicator in the middle of the screen is a custom control that I built that basically renders a nice visualization of a 0 to 100 number as a 75% indicator, and imagine that on the form as an indicator of how far we are with the process, etc. And you can quite easily add that to the form. So the Power Apps component framework, if you're a professional developer with an interest in the user experience, this is a great way to extend the system. We can also build Canvas apps, which I told you before we build with Power Apps, and it's this point-and-click easy way of building something that can connect to hundreds of different systems and services. And we can now embed that on a Dynamics form. On the bottom left, you see a contact navigation that is really a Power App with a great visualization of the contacts working for a company, and it's embedded in a Dynamics form. So we can now do things that were never possible or easy to do in the Dynamics user interface, we can do with point and click. We have a bunch of user experience guidelines. I will not go into detail on all of them, but let me just highlight a few things. You want to think about the sitemaps. You want to think about using dashboards and also the new interactive dashboards as jumping off points for users so they don't really have to navigate via the menu, but can just directly go to the things that they should work on. We have some guidance on how you do form design. So balance the number of forms that you have per entity. Look at your tab order and the number of tabs that you have on your entity. Guard against complexity. I call it the 7 chunks theory. People can remember 7 things, can make peace and put 7 things in context. You make things too complex, people lose the context. You need to design and test for reflow. You can no longer just test in the browser. You should test for the mobile form factor. See that it's going to work on the tablet, see that it will work on the phone. You may have a great web resource out there that renders beautifully on the web client, but when you put it on a phone, in the past we didn't have web resources, right? Now we do. And then maybe it doesn't render well on the phone, and you may need to add reflow considerations to your own web resources. And then just a little one, we are moving towards a capitalization structure across the product and the documentation of not using title case, but using sentence case. In other words, the first character is a capital and the rest would be lowercase. That tends to read easier, particularly if the strings are longer, and that becomes also a good design guidelines for your own text that you put in. We have some specific guidance on views and grids, number of apps, how you think about business processing, what you do with theming, and some principles around balancing the use of color, focusing on reducing clicks and scrolling, and generally reducing the clutter so that life is simpler for the end user. So more detail behind that, which we can do in subsequent presentations. Next step in the transition is really to get the value proposition out so that people understand what they're going to get if you do this project. A couple of guidance. I think start with personal value. Personal value to me comes first, because if the end user will see personal value, will feel more productive, will have a more enjoyable journey in the system with less distractions, we will drive personal business value. If I'm 10% productive and I'm in sales, I should sell 10% more. If I'm 10% more productive in customer service, I should see a reduction of cost and a reduction of customer churn. And customer churn in itself, if I reduce that, it implies there's more revenue staying in the organization. So we really want to get out and get the story behind the business value. We want to see some of the broad benefits we get, like reduced training and change management. The new Fluent design is more intuitive to use. And when users can find their own way around an app, because the apps are now simpler and the clutter is reduced, they don't need as much formal training. I mean, you don't see much formal training happening on the apps on your iPhone, right? People discover the functionality and use them. And that's where we want to head in this journey as well. And then there are some specific innovations that add value. And if you put them into your system, then the users will adopt this in a viral fashion. One power user will tell another power user, look what I can do in the system. Tips and tricks can be shared. You can do change management with user focus groups. And your cost of doing training and change management should go down significantly if you are investing in the unified interface. And then we go to improved user adoption. User adoption is still one of the top reasons for project failure, the other one being data quality, of course. So these are always, for me, ongoing concerns that we need to manage in every project. Because a unified interface is a modern immersive experience that excites users, you get a natural user adoption that's better than with a classic web client. And again, the personal value will drive the adoption. And so this is the key. I had if I can share the story quickly, I spoke to the head of corporate banking in a large financial institution, and she said to me, I can't force my relationship managers to use the CRM because the relationship manager with the biggest corporate relationship, the customer that brings us the most business, he has the power. He will decide whether to use that system or not. I don't have the power to dictate to him. And this is often the truth in a sales scenario. If your users don't use it, you won't get the value. And personal value for me is the key to success here. Right, now planning and executing the transition, just a few guidelines. Define your outcome, goals, and expectations. You know, if you don't know what the end game is, you reduce the odds of arriving there with success. Assess really the scope and then prioritize the scope. I like to rank requirements by business value. I like to rank requirements by effort. And I'd like to deliver some quick wins first and start early with the bigger high value investments, but get some quick wins out there. And then avoid distractions, you know, focus on the key stuff. Deliver incrementally. I'm not here to sell the agile approach to you today, but let's just say the waterfall approach, I think, is not the best way to approach this. We like the incremental delivery with regular delivery cycles. It supports ongoing learning, ongoing integration of end user feedback, which should give us a better outcome. And then do measure for success. That means you need to measure before and after, so that you can show the benefit that your project has brought. You don't so easily get new business investment if you haven't pre-measured, because then you can't tangibly see the improvement that you may have had. So this would be something to work on and agree. Our detailed decks have a lot more guidance there on things that you could measure, some specifics that could be quite useful to you. The measuring for success, a couple of ideas here just to share. One is to use dedicated security roles, because this allows you to monitor who's accessing which app. So you can draw the stats quite easily. So you can see if you've designed an app that is actually useful to people. Are the features that you put in the app actually useful to your people? You can build some dashboards internally using some of the metadata we have in Dynamics. For this dashboard, we also have some dashboards on the admin portal that provide you with analytics and insight into this. We've spoken about getting a baseline on your existing system, and then continuous communication and a feedback loop. So getting the feedback from your users, how's the system landing with them? Use that to see what we change in the next iteration of the system, tweak the system to get a better result. Then we also suggest that you work with your Microsoft and partner teams to help you achieve your goals and deliver the experiences. Depending on your relationship, you may have a FastTrack engineer involved, you may have a customer success manager involved, you may have an account executive working with you. These are people you can reach out to that will have access to more resources around transitioning to the unified interface, that can help you review any challenges that you may see on the journey, any design changes and gaps that affect your project. And that could also facilitate feedback directly back to our product group, so we can look at the journey going forward, bringing your feedback into that. So when you review on these cycles, we like to identify what I call the highly valuable processes, right, across the various business groups that do the system. If you keep revisiting those, you're focusing on the high value issues, you know. Always look at your original approach and see what new capabilities you might bring in to make those high valuable processes even better. Keep the mobile platform into account. In the past, mobile takeoff was relatively slow because, quite honestly, mobile did not have all the capabilities that we had in the web client, so people would rather use the web client in many respects. Now the capabilities are pretty solid on mobile, so you should find a natural viral adoption of people using their iPhones, their Android phones to come in and actually do work in Dynamics, people using their Android tablets and their iPads to do actual work in Dynamics. So this is definitely a trend that we see in parallel with the unified interface. We like reviewing our designs in sort of a prototype way. Deploy something to some key users and some business stakeholders. Let them experience it and get the feedback in. Encourage this agility concept across the business. You know, if you can't just be agile in IT and then business is still thinking in a waterfall approach. So it's useful to drive that. align with the concept of the modern workplace. We are talking a lot about dynamics today, but it's not just about dynamics. It's about Office 365. It's about other technologies. It's about workflow using technologies like Flow. It's about Power Apps bringing new and sexy apps into the space across Dynamics, across SharePoint, across many other systems. And then quite importantly, start thinking about automating your test processes. We are rapidly innovating as Microsoft at the moment. And I think in that we pose two challenges to our customers and our partners. One is just keeping up with everything that's happening. The second is really, how do I test that what Microsoft just deployed is not perhaps breaking something that I have running in production? And I think automating the test process when we're faced with this rapid change is a good way to detect and reduce the risk so that you can catch these things before they impact you. We may also need to retrain our users. People may be using a system mechanically, just as a data capture system, not really using it to drive the next level value add, and we need to do some thinking around that. This needs to be part of the overall experience. When you look at the product then, when it changes, when new aspects come in, new innovations get landed, what is landing and how do you take advantage of that? We now publish a pretty serious document, I think it's now heading for 200, 300 pages, which gives us the release notes. And our cadence is basically the April and October timeframe. So you expect every 6 months to see a major release from us. And the release notes that we have there, my recommendation is start reading at the table of content level, because that tells you at the high level what is coming. And then if something there grabs your interest, jump in from the table of content to the specific page, because there will be a lot of things that may not be appropriate for you to waste time reading, because it will not be for your organization a relevant piece of technology. But if you do selective reading on that, you'll pick up the things that could potentially add value to your environment and then bring that in and consider that as part of the cycle. You also need to consider what this refresh cadence in technology looks like, right? So there are a couple of things I want to put in. In the October release, there'll be a number of new features. Let's just call them, for the sake of the discussion, feature 1 to feature 6, right? So these are new things coming in October. We have a public preview that will already start in August. And in August, you can actually see these features already in the public preview. And these features will only become compulsory aspects of the system going forward, or new optional aspects of the system going forward from October onwards. So you may not see these in your productive environment, but you're already seeing it in your preview, in your playpen, so you can take advantage of learning, trying them out, seeing how it might work for you. You could also be on a very aggressive cycle. We say, give me the features as they arrive. So if we develop these features early on, you may have a sandbox where you want to see them on weekly updates on a continuous basis, so you can assess them as they go. But for your primary development environment and your production environment, you wouldn't do that. You'd wait for the major release points to get that. And so for the next release, we'll be delivering features 7 to 12. On a sandbox, you could bring them in immediately and look at them on a weekly basis. But generally speaking, you're going to look at them seriously in the public preview and then adopt them potentially in the next release cycle starting next April. So that's the refresh cadence. There will also be more detail in the supporting tech talk below this chapter. So we will quickly round up with a discussion around resources, and then I'll open for some questions. So if you look at this playbook, it's a good resource to give you a table of content to the entire space, something that is printable and that you could use as a quick guide. But for each of the chapters, for Initiate, Explore, Transition, and Optimized, we have a more detailed tech talk that zooms into those topics in more detail, and we will share those with you in future. We are planning some additional resources like exploratory workshops, so we document the structure. So if you want to spend a day and immerse yourself in the unified interface, we can help you do it. I have a link to the official documentation. And we will maybe share a few other links in future, but this is a really good jump-off point. And then a couple of things just as broad guidance. If you do participate in our FastTrack program, you can, of course, reach out to your assigned FastTrack solution architect for more information. If you are engaged with Microsoft services, you can reach out to their domain leads who also have a lot of knowledge in this space. If somebody is engaged in a pre-sales cycle, you can reach out to the account team. This is probably more relevant for partners engaging with customers that are ready to move to the unified interface. So if you're a partner, either the Microsoft account team or the partner account manager will connect you to our team. That concludes really the formal part of the presentation. I suggest that we take some questions on the chat. If you have a question, Martin, Phil, if there's anything on the chat, just read them to me and I can respond to that. And if there's a brave soul out there that wants to grab a mic and ask a question on voice, I'm all ears.
Yeah, so we have a few questions in chat. So first question is that if voice of the customer will reach unified interface.
So on voice of the customer, I think probably the only thing that I should say at this point is watch this space. We've not made any formal announcements in the space, but I do expect movement in the space. So just bear with us on that one and monitor our communications over the next weeks.
Okay, then we have one slide note. Enabling flow brings you a new user, and you might need permissions to it. In case you, for example, use Nord 52, I haven't seen that complicated. Johnny was sending that one.
Yeah, I think this is maybe something, depending on your engagement with Microsoft, you may want to ping us directly to talk through the detail. There may be some implications there, but it's difficult for me to assess right now. So I will park it and refer you maybe to somebody that can engage with the detail.
Yeah, and that was just comment from Pekka, but no other questions. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to ask directly.
Well, if it's all quiet, I don't mind giving you back some time. So last round, any further questions? Well, in that case, I thank you for your time. I enjoyed having this discussion with you. Please ping us as you want to move this forward. We will make the deck available later. We'll list out the resources. Thanks for attending. We really appreciate it. Goodbye and have a nice day.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for all that attended.